Okay, welcome everybody. This is Chapter 14 podcast on the autonomic nervous system, which is an efferent division of the nervous system that controls visceral function and maintains homeostasis. It's made up of a two neuron chain that runs from the central nervous system to the target and has two subdivisions, the parasympathetic or rest and digest division and the sympathetic or fight and flight division. Okay? It innervates every target with the exception of skeletal muscle, and it operates without conscious input. It's sometimes called the involuntary nervous system, and the main control centers are the hypothalamus and the brain stem. Okay? Both the somatic and autonomic nervous systems are efferent divisions that have motor fibers, but they differ in their targets, their pathways and ganglia, and what the neurotransmitters are that are used. In the somatic nervous system, the only target is skeletal muscle, and in the autonomic nervous system, we target everything but skeletal muscle. So cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, glandular tissue, and so on. Okay? These are efferent pathways. In the somatic nervous system, the efferent neurons lie in the ventral horn, the gray matter of the spinal cord, and they send one long axon all the way out to their skeletal muscle target, and the neurotransmitter is always acetylcholine. While in the autonomic nervous system, a two neuron chain is used to gain access to the target. There is a preganglionic neuron that runs from the central nervous system to a ganglia. Okay, the ganglia in the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system are the paravertebral ganglia, with the exception of some intramural ganglia, and in the um, parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, all of the ganglia are going to be intramural, meaning that they're going to be um, quite some distance from the central nervous system and relatively close to the target. Okay, so there's a two neuron chain. It's a slower set of neurons than we have in the somatic motor division because of either the lack of myelination or the reduced amount of myelination. Right? Remember, we talked about the fact that myelin is the insulating material in the axons of neurons that allow saltatory conduction at maximum speeds of 250 miles an hour, which we see in the somatic motor division and in the somatosensory divisions, but we have slower speeds for other divisions of the nervous system. Okay, so you can see in this diagram the differences in the two systems, right? If we look here, you see that in the somatic motor division, we have a single axon that runs from the neuron cell body in the ventral horn all the way to the skeletal muscle target. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter, and the effect is always excitatory, meaning it's going to promote depolarization, produce an action potential, and lead to a contraction. Whereas in the autonomic division, we have in the sympathetic autonomic division short preganglionic and long postganglionic neurons. Acetylcholine is always the neurotransmitter used by the preganglionic neurons in either division of the autonomic nervous system, but the postganglionic neurotransmitter in the sympathetic division is usually epinephrine or norepinephrine, while in the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, it is usually acetylcholine. And the effects can either be excitatory or inhibitory on the organ in question. Okay, another difference between the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions is that in the parasympathetic division, the preganglionic axon is very long and the postganglionic is very short, and that is flip-flopped in the sympathetic division. An exception here is a preganglionic neuron that innervates the adrenal medulla, okay, which causes neurosecretory cells here to release epinephrine into the bloodstream. Okay, so this is an example of a set of structures that is held both by the endocrine and the nervous system, right? The adrenal medulla, and we can also put in there the hypothalamus, okay? So there's overlap in those two systems, and we'll learn more about the endocrine system a little bit later on, okay? There is sometimes overlap of somatic and autonomic function. Most spinal and many cranial nerves have fibers from both, and adaptations usually involve skeletal muscle and visceral organs. Okay, so the skeletal muscle responses, those are voluntary. The visceral organ responses, those are involuntary, right? And we talked about the fact that in the body, the peripheral nerves can either be sensory, motor, or mixed, right? A sensory nerve is only going to carry information into the central nervous system. A motor nerve is only going to carry information out, and a mixed nerve is going to carry information in two directions, okay? But you can also have mixed nerves in terms of autonomic and somatic fibers, right? So there's any possible combination of nerve fibers you can have within a nerve, and the reason that that's possible without crosstalk is because of the presence of endoneurium around the nerve fibers. It has an insulating property, and the fact that many axons also contain myelin around the axon extensions. Okay? The sympathetic division and parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system usually have opposite effects on their target, and generally most of the targets experience dual innervation, meaning that there are nerve leads from both the sympathetic and parasympathetic division of the nervous system to the same target, although they get there via different nerve pathways. The only exception to this is that there is exclusively sympathetic innervation to the sweat glands and the erector pili muscle, okay? And there is one exception to that, which is parasympathetic innervation of the smooth muscle that controls blood flow into the clitoris and the penis, okay? That's really the only exception. All of the other targets are going to have dual innervation, okay? And it's usually dynamic antagonism between the two divisions that determines the state of that particular target. You can see a schematic here with the parasympathetic division on the left in purple and the sympathetic division on the right in green, okay? In the parasympathetic division, notice the long preganglionic and short postganglionic neurons, right? And in the sympathetic division, notice the short preganglionic and long postganglionic neurons, but notice how many of the targets are shared, all right? Notice also in the sympathetic division that most of the preganglionic neurons synapse in something known as the sympathetic chain ganglia, which lie on either side of the spinal cord outside the vertebral column. This is why the sympathetic division sometimes has the nickname the thoracolumbar division, while the parasympathetic has the nickname the craniosacral division. Okay, in the sympathetic autonomic nervous system, preganglionics exit from thoracic 1 all the way down to the last lumbar vertebrae, all right? Whereas in the craniosacral division, we have preganglionics that come from the brainstem and also the sacral spinal cord, okay? The parasympathetic division gets the nickname the rest and digest division, and basically its job is to promote the storage of energy in the form of fat or glycogen, promote excretion and secretion, reduce metabolic rate, okay, and promote diuresis, okay, and elimination. Effects on internal organs include a reduction in blood pressure and heart rate and respiratory rate. GI activity increases, so peristalsis speeds up, and secretion into the digestive system accelerates. Your pupils constrict, and your lenses in your eyes accommodate for close vision. Okay, and this is the system that's on most of the time in normal life. Okay, and it contains long preganglionic fibers that run from the brain stem or the sacrum almost all the way to the target, with a synapse on a postganglionic neuron that has a terminal ganglia close to the target, and then we hit the effector, and you can see the list of effectors here, right? In the cranial part of the parasympathetic division, we have cell bodies in the brainstem with preganglionics in the oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus nerves, okay? So those are cranial nerves 3 and 10, and let's see, glossopharyngeal 9 and 7. Okay. Oculomotor nerves control smooth muscle in the iris of the eye. Facial nerves can stimulate large glands in the head, and glossopharyngeal talk to the parotid salivary glands, while the vagus nerve is the major parasympathetic lead to the abdominal and the thoracic viscera. Okay, so pretty important and very long cranial nerve there. And then there are sacral nerves that target structures in the reproductive and the urinary system. Okay? The sympathetic division is going to become predominant in fight or flight situations. Perceived danger is going to cause an increase in heart rate, blood pressure, blood sugar, increase in sweat production. Okay, blood is going to be shunted towards skeletal muscle and away from GI, urinary, and reproductive. Okay, and also a lot of blood's going to go to the skeletal muscles in the heart. And the idea is that we're going to load the blood up with oxygen and nutrients to get to skeletal muscle to deal with our situation so that we can get out of danger. Another effect is to dilate the pupils and to produce dry mouth, right? And so you can see the targets here. Preganglionic neurons emerge from from thoracic vertebra 1 all the way down to lumbar 2, okay? And they form the lateral horns of the spinal cord, right? That's what they're for. And then there's usually a synapsing that goes on either in the paravertebral ganglia or in an intramural ganglia a bit closer to the target, okay? Remember that the neurotransmitter used by the preganglionic is acetylcholine, and the postganglionic is generally epinephrine or norepinephrine. The paravertebral ganglia vary in size, position, and number, and there's a total of 23. There are 3 cervical, 11 thoracic, 4 lumbar, and 4 sacral, with 1 coccygeal. Remember that the ganglia can span a lot greater length along the vertebral column than the preganglionic neurons can, because the paravertebral ganglia actually extend above T1 and below L2. Okay, so this is sort of a way to expand the range of the reach of the sympathetic autonomic nervous system, and you can see the paravertebral ganglia here. The connection between the pre and the postganglionic neurons is through what are called the rami communicans. So these are the on and off ramps for the preganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic division, or of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. And you can see them here. The reason they're called gray and white is because of the different degree of myelination. Okay, and then these are the paravertebral ganglia themselves, and they run on either side of the vertebral column. Okay, now the way that this works is that the white rami communicans serves as the on-ramp for the preganglionic neuron, and the gray serves as the off-ramp for the next part of the pathway. That's usually the postganglionic neuron, but there are some variations in the pathway that can occur as well. Upon entering the sympathetic trunk, short preganglionic neuron fibers can synapse with ganglionic neurons at the same level, and that postganglionic neuron can enter the ventral rami through the gray rami communicans, and this is the pathway taken for fibers that talk to sweat glands, the erector pili muscle, and vascular smooth muscle, which are all exclusive targets of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. We can also ascend or descend the sympathetic trunk to synapse in another ganglion. So we can move up a level or two or down a level or two, and then a postganglionic neuron will head out through the gray communicans and then on through a ramus towards a target. Okay. And then we can also have splanchic nerves that actually pass through the paravertebral ganglia and emerge heading on to an intramural ganglia that is closer to the intended target. Okay, so those effectors include things like abdominal organs. Okay, whereas the pathway where you go up or down a level will include those exclusive targets that we see in the sympathetic division, such as vascular smooth muscle, erector pili muscle, and sweat glands. Okay. In the head, fibers emerge from T1 through 4 and synapse in superior cervical ganglia, innervating skin and blood vessels in the head, stimulating dilator muscles in the iris, and inhibiting nasal and salivary gland secretion, and innervating smooth muscle in the upper eyelid. And they also branch to the heart. In the thorax, preganglionic fibers run from T1 through 6 and synapse in cervical trunk ganglia, while postganglionics emerge from the middle and inferior cervical ganglia and enter the spinal nerve C4 through C8. This innervates the heart through the cardiac plexus, the thyroid glands in the skin, and the lungs in the esophagus. Most fibers from T5 through L2 synapse in collateral ganglia and form thoracic, lumbar, and sacral splanchic nerves that include the celiac and superior and inferior mesenteric ganglia. Okay, and so these are going to talk primarily to the distal GI. Okay, among other structures. In the abdomen, preganglionic fibers from T5 through L2 travel through thoracic splanchics, and synapses occur in celiac and superior mesenteric ganglia and target the stomach, the intestines, the liver, spleen, and kidneys. Preganglionic fibers from T10 through L2 travel through lumbar and sacral splanchics, synapsing in inferior mesenteric and hypogastric ganglia. Postganglionic fibers serve the distal large intestine, urinary bladder, and reproductive organs, and inhibits activity of muscles and glands in the abdominal pelvic visceral region. Some preganglionic fibers pass directly into the adrenal medulla and do not synapse. Upon stimulation, medullary cells secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine directly into the blood. The sympathetic ganglia and adrenal medulla have the same origin in embryonic development. They come from the same stuff. So basically, when you freak out, when you go fight or flight, what happens is that you have help from both the sympathetic autonomic division through epinephrine being sprayed onto targets to aid with fight or flight, as well as epinephrine in the bloodstream to extend the effect. And that's one of the reasons why after you panic, you don't immediately calm down. Now, just like we have reflex arcs that involve skeletal muscle, we can have reflex arcs that involve organ targets, right? Visceral reflex arcs have the same components as a somatic arc, but the visceral reflex arc has two neurons in the motor pathway. Visceral pain afferents can travel along the same pathways as somatic pain fibers, and that's part of what contributes to referred pain, that phenomenon where we have pain coming from an internal organ, but it's actually felt on the surface of the body in another location. Cholinergic fibers release acetylcholine. All autonomic preganglionic axons are cholinergic. All somatic motor axons are cholinergic. And all parasympathetic postganglionics are cholinergic at the effector synapse. Adrenergic fibers release norepinephrine, and those include most sympathetic postganglionic neurons, with the exception of sympathetic postganglionic fibers that secrete acetylcholine at sweat glands, and that causes them to increase sweat production. So here we are back at our diagram. right? With a better understanding of the wiring that goes on. Remember that all the autonomic function happens without conscious input, so all this goes on without you having to think about it. Because we release different types of neurotransmitters on our targets, we have to have different types of receptors on those targets to bind to those neurotransmitters and then generate a change in the target, right? So we have cholinergic receptors on targets that are sprayed with acetylcholine and adrenergic receptors on targets that are sprayed with epinephrine. Two kinds of receptors bind acetylcholine, nicotinic and muscarinic, and they're named after drugs that were discovered that bound those receptors. Nicotinic receptors are found on the sarcolemma of skeletal muscle cells at the neuromuscular junction, and all postganglionic neurons, whether they be sympathetic or parasympathetic, and also the hormone-producing cells of the medulla. And the effect of acetylcholine is always stimulatory. Okay, so that's relatively straightforward. It pops ion channels, it depolarizes the postsynaptic cell, and makes it more likely that you're going to generate an action potential. Muscarinics are found on effector cells that are stimulated by postganglionic cholinergic fibers, and the effect of acetylcholine can either be inhibitory or excitatory depending on the receptor and the type of organ. Adrenergic receptors are either alpha or beta, right? And among the alpha adrenergics are alpha 1 and 2, and the beta have a beta 1, 2, or 3. And the effects of norepinephrine depend on which subclass of receptor predominates on the target, right? Most visceral organs are dual innervated, with the exception of, as we said, vascular smooth muscle, erector pili muscle, and sweat glands. The antagonism of these two divisions allows us to control visceral function, right? The sympathetic division jacks up your heart rate, respiratory rate, and blood pressure, and inhibits digestion and waste removal, while the parasympathetic does the opposite, okay? And so it's not as if when one is on, the other is off. It's that they seesaw for control, okay? One becomes more predominant while the other one sinks into the background, okay? The sympathetic division has exclusive control of blood pressure. The vascular system is entirely innervated by sympathetics, with the exception of the smooth muscle that surrounds the vasculature that allows blood into the clitoris and the penis, right? While sympathetic tone keeps blood vessels in a continual state of partial constriction, raising the blood pressure. Reduction in sympathetic tone lowers the blood pressure. Okay, so it's either more or less sympathetic innervation. Sympathetic fibers fire more rapidly, causing BP to go up, and less rapidly, causing it to drop. Sometimes we use alpha blockers to interfere with vasomotor fibers in order to treat conditions like hypertension, right, where your blood pressure is high all the time. Parasympathetic tone is going to dominate in the heart, the smooth muscle of the GI and urinary, and activate most glands with the exception of the sweat glands and the adrenal medulla, right, which you know are exclusive targets of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. It's going to slow the heart. It's going to dictate normal activity levels of GI and urinary, and can be overridden by the sympathetic division when fight or flight becomes something that we're aware of, right? Drugs that block parasympathetic response are going to increase heart rate and cause fecal and urinary retention, right? Because they're going to have essentially the same effect as sympathetic innervation, okay? Now, there are some examples where we have cooperative effects between the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. This is seen in the control of the external genitalia, where parasympathetic fibers cause vasodilation of the vascular smooth muscle that feeds the clitoris and the penis, and sympathetic fibers promote ejaculation of semen in males and reflex contraction of a female's vagina, as well as production of lubricant. Okay? The adrenal medulla, the sweat glands, and the erector pili muscles, as well as the kidneys and blood vessels, are only sympathetic targets. So sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is going to be a big player in thermoregulation, in the release of renin from the kidneys, and in controlling our metabolic rate by increasing the metabolic rates of cells and raising blood glucose levels. All right, so it's going to promote gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis. It also helps to mobilize fat for use as fuel. The parasympathetic division effects are usually short-lived and highly localized over their effectors because they don't have an adjunct assist from the endocrine system. In addition, acetylcholinesterase usually wipes out acetylcholine's effect on the target, while the sympathetic division has longer lasting effects because it takes longer to inactivate norepinephrine, and the adrenal medulla, of course, helps out by dumping tons of this into the bloodstream. Okay? The hypothalamus is the overlord of the autonomic and the endocrine systems. Okay? And what happens here is that stimuli that come from the subconscious cerebrum, as well as stimuli that are in ascending pathways that are filtered out by the thalamus that come from primarily visceral inputs, are going to be routed to the hypothalamus. It also communicates with the reticular formation of the brainstem and the spinal cord, right, in addition to the cortex. Control can be either direct or indirect through the reticular activating system. Remember that the reticular activating system is connected to the thalamus and controls the gates of perception. Okay? Hypothalamic input controls heart activity and blood pressure, body temperature, water balance, and endocrine activity, and emotional states such as rage, pleasure, as well as drives like hunger, thirst, and sex, and our reactions to the fight or flight system. So essentially, you could think of the hypothalamus and the brainstem as like a primitive brain that contains survival responses, okay? And it developed long before the cerebral cortex did in evolution, and it also develops before the cerebral cortex does in development, okay, which seems not to be a coincidence. So you can see the different levels of input, right? We've got unconscious cortical control, we've got emotional input into the hypothalamus, and then we have output to the brainstem via the reticular formation and the nuclei and the pons and medulla, and ultimately that is going to head down the ventral spinal cord, exit via the lateral horn nuclei in the sympathetic division, or the isolated nuclei in the brainstem and nuclei in the sacral spinal cord, and those two neuron chains will then head to their targets and exert their effects. Connections of the hypothalamus to the limbic system allow cortical influence over the autonomic system, so voluntary control with training is possible through conditions such as biofeedback, where we become aware of our physiology and try to consciously influence it. And this can allow us in some cases to control stress. Now, this isn't for everybody, right? It works in some cases, and in other cases it doesn't work. There are extraordinary examples of biofeedback in which during the initiation ceremonies for the monks that live in the Tibetan monasteries, they are the initiates are sent out into the cold mountain air at night with nothing but a wet linen sheet. And the idea is that they are going to sit in a group, in a circle, and then through biofeedback control over their thermoregulation, they're going to raise the temperature sufficiently to dry the sheets and melt the snow around them and not freeze to death. And it's been shown that they can do this, okay? But obviously there's a level of training there that most individuals don't have, okay? So that would be the route to that would be some sort of cortical connection from the cortex to the limbic system to the hypothalamus, okay, through meditation, okay. Not everybody can achieve this, but obviously if it's something that's within the realm of possibility, then we have limitless possible control over things like disease state and mood control that we could possibly use to improve patient outcomes in disease states. Okay, so that's one of the things that we look at in what's called alternative medicine, which are approaches to conditions that affect people that use techniques other than drugs and surgery. Okay. All right, that brings me to the end of chapter 14, relatively short chapter. What follows is a discussion of the autonomic nervous system. So stay tuned for that, and I will see everybody in the next podcast. And I thank you for listening.
In this video, I want to introduce the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system, which is part of the overall nervous system. And this is a functional division of the nervous system, not a structural division like the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The autonomic nervous system consists of efferent neurons in the peripheral nervous system that do specific jobs. So these are efferent neurons, and these neurons control 3 different types of cells. The first are smooth muscle cells, which are in all sorts of structures all over our body, like around our blood vessels. And they control cardiac muscle, the muscle that makes up our heart tissue. So cardiac muscle. And these muscle tissue types are different than the skeletal muscle, the muscle that's all over attached to our skeleton that moves us around, because those are controlled by different efferent neurons of the peripheral nervous system. Those are controlled by lower motor neurons, not autonomic neurons. The last thing that autonomic neurons control are gland cells. Some gland cells are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Now, the autonomic nervous system is called this because it tends to control all these things without conscious involvement. It doesn't require the involvement of consciousness to control these things. So it's kind of autonomous. It kind of does this stuff on its own without our conscious cells having to be involved for the most part. And we divide the autonomic nervous system into 2 big subsystems. So let me write 2 big arrows here. And this part we call the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system, which is the first big part of the autonomic nervous system. So I'll just write SNS for short, for sympathetic nervous system. And this other big part we call the parasympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic, so I'll just write PNS for short, for parasympathetic nervous system. And there are a number of big differences between these 2 parts of the autonomic nervous system that we can talk about in this kind of introductory talk. The first big difference is kind of where they start in the central nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system starts in the middle of the spinal cord, kind of the middle part of the spinal cord. Let me draw a bunch of somas here. And I'll just take one of these here, and I'll draw a little short axon on the first neuron that's coming out of the central nervous system. And then it's going to synapse with a second neuron in a ganglia close to where the first neuron is. And then the second neuron is going to send the longer axon to reach its target cell. So let me just draw a big T to represent some kind of target cell that it's going to synapse on. And this target cell will be a smooth muscle cell, a cardiac muscle cell, or a gland cell. And here's an illustration of kind of the entire autonomic nervous system. And here they're showing kind of the middle part of the spinal cord that all these first neurons in the sympathetic nervous system are starting. And then there's a short axon till they synapse in a ganglia that's pretty close to the spine. Here's a set of ganglia, and here are a few other ganglia, but they all tend to be pretty close to the spine. This set of ganglia are actually often linked together in kind of a chain, which we actually call the sympathetic chain. And here's just a different illustration of the same thing. So here it's showing in the middle part of the spinal cord that first axon's coming out, synapsing in a ganglia close to the spine, with a lot of these ganglia linked together in a chain, and then the second neuron sending a longer axon out to synapse on the target cell in whatever tissue you're talking about that contains smooth muscle cells, cardiac muscle cells, or gland cells. Now, the parasympathetic nervous system has its first neurons start in a different place in the central nervous system. They start either up here in the brainstem, or they start way down here at the bottom of the spinal cord. And then their first neuron tends to send a long axon out to synapse with the second neuron in a ganglion at a distance from the first neuron. And then that second neuron usually sends out a short axon to synapse on its target cell. I'll just write a big T here for target cell. And here this illustration is showing this as well, where it's showing the first neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system either up here in the brainstem or down here at the bottom of the spinal cord. And then it's showing these long axons on the first neuron until it reaches a ganglia at a distance from the first neuron soma, and then a shorter axon on that second neuron until it reaches its target cell. And here's another illustration just showing the same thing. So here's these first axons coming out of either the brainstem up high or the bottom part of the spinal cord down low. And then these first long axons go all the way till they meet a ganglion at a distance from the first neuron soma. And then the second neuron sends a shorter axon to the target cells. So the similarities in the structure of the different parts of the autonomic nervous system are that they both usually consist of a chain of two neurons connecting the central nervous system to the target cell. But the differences are where those first neurons start and whether there's a short first axon and a long second axon, or a long first axon and a short second axon. But more importantly than these structural differences between the different parts of the autonomic nervous system are the functional differences. And these neurons do so many different things in so many tissues of the body that it's a little hard to talk about them in general. But there are these great phrases that can kind of help think through lots of the changes that these different parts of the autonomic nervous system do. And for the sympathetic nervous system, the phrase is fight or flight. Fight or flight. That the sympathetic nervous system, when it's activated, will cause lots of changes in the body that'll prepare to either fight or run away, which can kind of help you deal with threatening or dangerous situations. So I'll write that in red here for the sympathetic nervous system, whereas the parasympathetic nervous system, I'll write in a nice cool green here, because its phrase is rest and digest. Rest and digest. So when it's active, it often causes lots of changes in the body that are more important for homeostasis and just maintenance of the body in non-threatening situations. So let's take a few examples of a few tissues where these different responses happen to get a feel for what this means. So first, let's look down here at the gastrointestinal system, the intestines or the gut. And both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system play a role in a lot of activities of the gastrointestinal system. But one is blood flow to the intestines, because the amount of blood flowing through the intestines plays a big role in how much digestion the intestines can do. Blood flow to intestines. And it also plays a big role in how much blood is available for other parts of the body. So when the sympathetic nervous system is activated in some kind of fight or flight situation, blood flow to the intestines decreases. And that blood is actually diverted away from the intestines, often to skeletal muscle. So all our muscles all over our body that can help us move to deal with dangerous situations, the blood is going to leave the intestines and go to that. Because during a dangerous situation is not the time to be digesting food, it's the time to be moving. So the blood flow decreases to the intestines and is diverted to skeletal muscle. Whereas most of the time, when you're in a non-threatening situation and it's time to rest and digest, the peripheral nervous system is activated, and that increases blood flow to the intestines. That'll divert blood away from skeletal muscle because now you're not in a fight or flight situation and you want to rest and digest. So it's going to bring the blood flow back to the intestines to increase your ability to digest food. If we look at the heart, both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems innervate the heart, and we look at the heart output, kind of how much blood the heart is pumping out over any particular unit of time, heart output of blood. When the sympathetic nervous system is activated, the heart output increases. The heart pumps harder and pumps faster and pushes more blood out so that things like skeletal muscle can get more blood flow. In addition to diverting blood flow from the intestines to skeletal muscle, the heart's just going to push more out so there's more available for the skeletal muscle. When the parasympathetic nervous system is activated, the heart output goes down. The heart is pumping less hard and it's beating less often. It's just working less because you don't need as much blood flow to the muscles for movement. So you go to kind of a baseline level that's sufficient for activities that involve resting and digesting. So these examples of blood flow involve the activity of smooth muscle, because smooth muscle is around our blood vessels and determines where the blood is going to flow to, and cardiac muscle, because the cardiac muscle makes up the heart. And then if we think about gland cells, there's a bunch of different glands that the autonomic nervous system controls, and they tend to be activated kind of differently at different times. So one type of gland that's activated during fight or flight situations when the sympathetic nervous system is active are sweat glands out here in the skin. And the sweat glands are activated to secrete sweat, which helps cool us down, which increases our ability to move faster and farther if we're able to stay cool. Whereas some glands that are activated by the parasympathetic nervous system include things like the salivary glands that produce saliva in our mouth, because saliva is very useful for digestion, and it's part of a number of activities that happen that help us digest food. So I find these phrases helpful when I'm thinking about what effects the autonomic nervous system will have on different tissues of the body during different situations. Because, like in all of these examples, most of the things that the sympathetic nervous system does when it's activated increase the body's ability to turn stored energy into movement to deal with dangerous situations, like moving blood from the intestines to skeletal muscle, and increasing the amount of blood being pumped around from the heart, and increasing sweat production from sweat glands to keep us cool while we're moving to deal with a dangerous situation. Whereas all of these things that the parasympathetic nervous system is doing make sense in non-threatening situations where we're actually trying to conserve and store energy, like diverting blood flow away from skeletal muscle to the intestines to increase digestion, decreasing heart cardiac output to conserve energy, and increasing saliva production from the salivary glands to help with digestion as well. But the autonomic nervous system affects many more structures and has many more functions than I can cover in this little introductory video. For instance, autonomic neurons play a role in changing the size of your pupils in your eyes, in sexual responses, and in secretion from a whole bunch of other glands. And because it does so many different things, I find it best to actually not cover it all in one sitting, but instead to cover these things as you're studying each individual organ system, because almost any organ system you're going to cover is going to have autonomic neurons coming in and affecting how that organ system functions.